Oh, we are finally at the stage where we can look at layout and styling. I know this is the really good stuff. This is where we finally start to look at really working in Oxygen. Now there is a lot to cover here, like a lot. This lesson will be much longer than the others. There's a lot of stuff in the layout to go through. So make sure you've got a drink or something to get you through this lesson. But let's not waste any more time in this intro and let's get stuck into it. Let's take a look at layouts and styles in Oxygen. We're going to start by looking at layouts, and there are really two main ways that you will style stuff in Oxygen. There's one called Flexbox and there's one called CSS Grid. Now Flexbox is what we call one-dimensional. You can create rows and columns, but you can only display it as a row or a column at any one time. CSS Grid is actually two-dimensional in that you can create rows and columns and be displaying rows and columns at the same time. Now that might not mean a lot at this stage, but we'll create an example here and show you the difference. So what we'll do is we'll click Add and we'll add a section. Now I want to point out quickly, we've added a section in here on the right, and if we look at the left, you can see it gives us these layout options. This is the layout options for the child elements, and that means the things that go inside of this section or div. By default, it's set up as vertically stacked and as a flexbox. The next one here is as a horizontally stacked flexbox. So this is essentially rows and this is columns. Now the next option is to create a grid. We're not going to look at that yet. We're going to create that afterwards. Now to help illustrate this as being rows, I'm just going to add a background color in here. And then I'm going to insert some stuff inside of this and we can see how it's being laid out. So I'll click and I'll put a div in here. And I'll give this a little bit of styling. So we'll make this white. And I'm going to go give this some sizing and some spacing. So I'll make this say 20% wide. I'll give this some padding of say 20 pixels. And I'll give this a margin of just a small margin of say 1%. And I'm going to place some text inside of that. I'll put some lorem ipsum in there and I'll delete a little bit of this. Okay, so you can see what we've got here is a section with a div, and inside that div we have some text. If I duplicate that, you'll see that that div is being added directly underneath. So I'll create 4, for example. Now this is because it's being displayed as rows. We've set it at the width at 20%. You'll see that we're looking at this div. We've got the div selected, and the div also has the same structure. It's got our layout options as vertical, horizontal, and grid. So we'll go back to our section here so we can show how this changes. Now if we go to horizontal, you'll see that all of this stuff has laid out like columns versus rows. Now we have some alignment options here. We can align this to the left, which it is by default. We can align it to the center. We can align it to the right. And we can do something called space around, which means it works out the gaps between each of these elements and it makes them the same. Or you can space between, which means it's going to shove this div and this div up to the edge and then add the gaps between them. So this is a nice way to actually fill some space without needing to set specific sizes. Now we also have a vertical alignment, and to help illustrate that, what I'll do is I'll take some of this text out of one of these. So this one here, I'll just delete this text out and you can see that it's a little bit shorter. I'll do this one too, make this one quite a lot shorter. So now we have 4 different sizes. We'll go back to this section and then we'll have a look at how this vertical alignment works. So at the moment, by default, it's aligned to the top, which is probably how you want stuff most of the time. But you can also align everything inside of that section by the middle, by the bottom, or stretch. And what this does is it means that everything will align or fit the same space, which is really good for creating cards or things that need set similar height. If I duplicate this and I make this one green, for example, so we can see the difference, and I can go and change this layout here to grid. So now that we have this set up as a CSS grid, we don't actually need some of these styles. We don't want this to be 20% wide. And the reason for that is because as we create columns, it's going to fit 20% of the space of our column. So if we had a column that was, say, 50% wide, then this is only going to display as 20% of that 50%. So that's not going to work very well. So we essentially want the CSS grid to control our width and our layout. So I'm quickly going to just go in here and start removing some of this widths from these divs. I don't want the margins here either, so I'll just get rid of these. And I'll do that on all of these. So get rid of the width and get rid of this margin as well. Again, go into advanced. We'll get rid of the width, get rid of the margin, get rid of the width, and get rid of that margin. Okay, so now you can see they're all displaying at 100% wide for this actual section. So let's go back to this grid and you can see we've got a few things here. We've got columns. At the moment we've got one column. We've got a few things like the minimum width, and then we've got here the max width. It's got something here called FR, which is probably new to you. That's essentially a fraction. And so what a fraction means is the percentage of the element or column that you're in. So you could say 0.5, and that's half of the column. So we've got one column, and we're now at half a column. We can go to 1, and that's a full column. It sounds complicated, but most of the time you can use one fraction, and you're going to control the grid layout in other areas. We've also got the gap between our columns, but at the moment we can't see this because we've only got one column set up. So let's actually change that. We'll change this to 3, and you can see there we've got this displaying automatically as 3, and it wraps around to a new row. Like I said, we can change this gap here to say 50 pixels, and you can see that update. You can change this to percentages or rems or ems, anything you like. I'll just go back to 20 pixels for now. And if we scroll down here, you can see we've got some of this stuff around rows. Now, rows by default are set to auto, which means as you add new content, new rows get added. You can see down the bottom here that we've got a representation of what our grid is doing. So if we add more by duplicating these and go duplicate, 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 maybe say create 8 of these, and we go back to our section, scroll down so you can see this here, you can actually see that this is represented directly again, and the new rows are added. You can go here and explicitly force the amount of rows, but unless you have a fixed amount of content, you're not going to want to force the amount of rows. So it's best to leave this to auto. And even if you're only going to have a certain amount of elements in here, such as 4 divs, for example, you don't need to set that to be 2 rows. It's just going to know. Again, we can change the gap here between these, and this is the stuff underneath it between the actual rows and not the columns. So we can change that to 50. We'll go back to 20 again. We've got the same sort of layouts here. We've got this for the left and right in the columns, and we've got the vertical alignment for rows. So at the moment it's stretched. If we went to start, for example, you can see this smaller one starts to actually fill the same space as it all gives it its own amount of space. Again, we can go center, end, or stretch, and it will fill that space. We can actually say that we want our child elements, which is these divs, to fit a certain amount or span across a certain amount of columns or rows. So for example, if we go up here and change this to 4, you can come down here and specifically say that you want each of your divs to go across 2 columns. Now, that might not be something you need to do very often, so we'll just go back to the default. I'm going to again update this to 3, and then I'm going to show you something really fun with CSS Grid. Now, how I was showing you before that you can see this representation of where the grid is at the moment, you can select any one of these and then give it a span of the row or the column. So you could take this first one, for example, and make it go across 2 of the rows. And then you could take this next one, the next div, and make it span over 2 of the columns. And then we could take this second to last one, make that go over 2 columns, and then get this one here and make it go over 2 rows. And you can see pretty easily we've made this really complicated layout that would be very hard to do in something like Flexbox. And this is where I was saying that this Flexbox is one-dimensional in that it can only be doing rows or columns at one time. And Grid, you can be dealing with columns and rows both at the same time. So it gives you a lot of power. Now, enough about layout. I'm going to remove this CSS Grid thing for now, and we're going to start looking at styling stuff. So you've probably seen me creating some styles already, and you've probably picked up a few things, but let's actually explain what's going on now. And I'll start with some of these things that we have here already. So if I select one of these divs, we have a whole load of styling options. I've mentioned this before, but no matter what you select, this primary interface here, this primary panel, changes to give you the standard things related to the type of element that you're selecting. So I'm selecting some text here, and the things that we get to choose here might be that we want to change from the normal text to the heading text, or any other font in Google Fonts, for example. We can change stuff like the text color. And these are all in our primary areas. Now if I select a div, you can see that this primary stuff here changes to things that relate to that div. So for example, the alignment of the text, we can change that. Things like the width of it, the background color. But each element that we add gives us this advanced tab. So if we go into that, there's a whole load of styling options in here. Now let's go through these by creating a new section. So we'll go add, section, and we'll start to style this together. What we can do here is give us a background color, and we can give this a text color. Now that means any text that we place inside here is going to pick up that as the color. Now you can individually style these by changing the color, but what we want to look at for now is styling some of this stuff in the section. So if we go under advanced, these are some of the standard things that you'll be looking at. So for example, backgrounds. There's a lot of stuff under here, but you'll notice that this background color, which we selected in the primary area, comes across into the background in advanced. We can do some things like adding a background image. And if we browse this, it goes to our media library. We can select that and it will insert a background image in there. Now there's some background image positioning options. So for example, by default, it's cover, which is perfect. That's what we want. And I can explain these to you. Cover essentially means that it's going to fill the space of the element that the background is inside of. So for example, if you go contain, you can see that it's repeating there. So cover will always fill that space. Auto is going to keep that at exactly 100%, and you can see this image is quite large. And manual, you can change the size by pixels or percentages. So you could say 50% wide, and you can see that that's doubling across now. You've got options like repeating. So no repeat, repeat, repeat on X or repeat on Y, which means the across and down. But most of the time, you can leave it as repeat or no repeat, depending on what you want to do. And cover, if you're doing a background like this, is perfect. There are situations where you might do, say, a background image that is an icon and you want to position it specifically next to the text or in front of the text, which is where you might give it a manual size and fix the position. So that's handy to do. Now, commonly with background images, we'll set this to a percentage of being 50% left and 50% from the top. And that just means that image is going to be fitting right in the middle. So for example, if we say 0% at the top, that's the top of the image that we see right along the top edge of this section. We can say 100% from the top, and then that's the bottom fitting the bottom edge of the section. So 50% means we're placing this right smack bang in the middle. Now another thing with backgrounds is doing something like an image overlay. This is where you might put a color over the top of your background image. So if you select a color here, you'll see our background image totally disappears. But if we pull back the color a little bit, you can see through, and you're starting to get essentially a color over the top of your background image. So you select the color and then you can change the opacity, which can give you some good effects and can allow you to make stuff so the text is easier to read. So that's easier to read here than if I take away this image overlay. We've got a few other things such as blend modes. So this will change the way that the background image relates to the color behind it. So you're going to say multiply, for example, or overlay, and you can see that the colors are changing, similar to, say, a design software. So that's what this does. You can add videos in backgrounds, and also with backgrounds, what you can do is choose to hide those video backgrounds once it gets under a certain amount of size. There are a few other options in here, such as gradients, and we'll be using those throughout the course, but that's enough for backgrounds. Now we've got size and spacing. That seems fairly obvious. Most of this stuff is going to be related to a few things, and sections only have what we call padding, whereas a div has what we would call paddings and margins. So padding is on the inside of an element. So if we've got a div, it goes on the inside of it, whereas a margin is on the outside. So for example, this will give us more space outside of that white area. So if we say 2%, for example, this is getting 2% above the white space. Whereas if we change this to 40 pixels, it gives us more space inside of, more padding inside of the div that we have there. Now you've got your width. With your width, you can set what the current width you're looking at. You can set a minimum width, so that means it can't go under that size, and you can set a maximum width. So you might say you don't want this div to ever get bigger than 800 pixels. You can do the same thing with heights as well by specifying the heights, the minimum height and the maximum height. We've got layout, and there is some really cool advanced stuff that you can do with layouts. And like before, when we looked at selecting these or adding these, by default it's set up as vertical flexbox. So when we go into here and go to layout, it's got flex already enabled. So that's what some of this is. It's displaying as flex. The align items are flex start. It's no wrap. So these are all related to that flex positioning. Now there are a few other things that we can do around Z indexes, around visibility, and around positioning. And we'll do that when we look at some more advanced layout stuff. Typography, fairly obvious stuff. And anything that we have here that isn't already assigned by the typography itself, such as the color here, we can go back to the div and control the color and things like your line height here. So we can change the color. And I've shown you this before. You can change things like the amount of line height you want in here. So you want to have a really crazy amount of line height. So you can control some of that stuff here that goes across the typography in that div. Moving on, we've got stuff called borders, and borders do a couple of things. So you've got essentially the border around the element. By default, you're editing all, but you can select to just do something like the top, the right, or the bottom. So I'll show you what it is if you do all of them, and we'll make a border of, say, green, and we'll make the width, say, 5 pixels, and we'll make it solid. And you can see we've got a border around here. Now we can unset all borders, which means basically delete all the borders we've already added. Then we could do something like go to the bottom and add, again, a green border, make this, say, 16 pixels, and a solid border again. And you can see we've added a border just along the bottom. The other thing in here is the border radius. So I want to get rid of that border. The border radius is essentially the edge that we have on here. So you could make the edge, say, 30 pixels, and it gives us that nice smooth edge. And again, we can do this individually by going and edit individual radii, where you can do something like 50 for the top left, and say 1 for the top right, 1 for the bottom left, and 50 for the bottom right, and make, I guess, a unique shape like that. So that's the two different types of borders that we've got. We've got the border radius and the border style. Now we've got a few things like effects. I'm going to go through this in another video. We're going to do some advanced style stuff. So we'll look at that later. We've also got custom CSS, custom JavaScript, and attributes. And we're going to save these again for another video. So these ones that we've run through now are the core building blocks for creating stuff, and they can be done across anything. So let's actually add something new, and we'll do one from scratch. And you can see that we'll have the same process. We'll add something like a button, and we'll do that in this section here. So if we go add button, you can do things like we've already looked at. So we'll go in here and we'll go to advanced, and we'll do some of this stuff like we can change the background color of this button to be green. We can change the typography to be dark blue. We could do some stuff like giving this some more space. So you might want to give this some margin above the top of, say, 20 pixels. And that's going to push that away from the text above it. We can do a few things like change that border radius. And maybe we do something strange like giving the border on the top 0, and the ones along the bottom we could make, say, 18 or 28. I've done 28. 28. And then we could put a border style along the top. So I'm just showing you some ideas that you could create. We have blue border along the top of, say, 10 pixels. So a bit of a strange looking button here, but you can see we're just doing it the same way that we did on the div. We're just changing those styles. So that's a quick look at how we would do this to any element that we add. Now, we do have more to look at with styles. We're going to look at things like mobile responsiveness, but we're doing that in the next lesson. If you've been playing along or doing some of this while we're working, I recommend you leave this one open because we can actually look at how we would change the style of this for different mobile devices or for different screen sizes. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next lesson. So leave this one open and we'll continue on with this layout or anything that you've done in the next lesson. Wow, that was a lot to get through. How are you going with that? Now, if you have a good idea of the layout and how to do some of the styling in Oxygen, you really are halfway there. You're almost at a point where you can start getting stuck into things yourself. But don't leave yet. We've got a lot more to cover. We've got a few more things in this module first, and then we're going to start building the site together. So click complete, and I'll see you in the next lesson.